The next speaker is Fr Rene.
I imagine you'll be still reflecting and feeling from the last talk, the last witness that was so beautiful. And what I want to do is begin a little bit with just talking a very little bit at the beginning of talking about St. Augustine. St. Augustine, many years ago in the 4th century, was living in northern Africa, and as he grew up, not believing in God, even though his mother was very religious, and his father was okay with whatever. And as he grew older, he began his search for God. But when he was about 19 years old, as recounted in the Confessions, he began to have a very deep friendship with this other young man about his own same old age. He never names him, but he gives that little bit you have in that handout is a description that's tagged on to their friendship. And this young man, they share everything. St. Augustine at that point is not quite a saint yet. He's having lots and lots of sexual experiences, all heterosexual, and he's totally engrossed with sex. But this friendship that he has with this particular male is enabled. And then, right after their friendship has been going on for a year or two, then this young man takes sick, and after a brief moment of recovery, he very suddenly dies. And that little excerpt that you have is his description, first of all, of the friendship they have, and then of the after effect. He talks about the fact that he is so tied up to this other man that he finds that he's half of his soul, that he's his other self. And then he goes on and talks about the way he mourns and gets through this. It takes a long time, as you saw in the witness that was just given, 3 years, 4 years, whatever it takes. And I want to talk about that, but I want to begin, most of what I'm going to say, I'm going to read, but this first part, which was a really moving aspect of my own life and rather pivotal for me. I was already ordained priest and I was already a monk, but I was living in the dormitories, and there was this guy living there whom I'm going to call Tim. That wasn't his real name, but just I kept thinking afterwards, I wonder if there'd be a funeral director up from that little town, or I wondered, since I've lost Tim's, what he's up to, I wondered if he would be here. So I've disguised it slightly, but not very much. And in that story, what I discovered is something that has affected me for the rest of my life in thinking about death, in thinking about mourning. Tim was a student on my floor back in the 70s. And you know, most Friday nights, most Saturday nights, there's an exodus that goes on still today. I just moved out of the dorms 2 years ago. An exodus that goes on in which every Friday and Saturday night, St. John's tends to empty a little bit. And it goes over to St. Joe, either to St. Ben's or to one of the local watering holes. And it was December, late November, I'm not sure which, But I usually go up and down the hall, and not for checking at that early hour. It's too early to check for people that are in trouble. But I go up and down and stop in rooms that are open. And I stopped in Tim's room because his door was open, and just started to visit with him a little bit, talked about how studies were going, how things were as far as friendships, and just the usual college conversation that a snoop like me tries to get out of them. And I started talking about, after the grades and after talking about making friends and so on, I asked him, tell me a little bit more about your family. And so he talked about his mother and his sister. And there's always a little bit of a danger signal when that happens, when you get 2, but not 3. And so I stopped and waited a little bit and said, you didn't mention your dad. And so I just left it at that because I didn't want to say anything more. And then he said, without apparent emotion, he said, "Oh, my dad died in a car accident on an icy road about when I was 13. And then we paused again. And for about 20 or 30 seconds, it was just silence. And then he began to cry. And then he began to sob. And that went on for a long time. I just put my arm around him and let him sob. And finally, when that sobbing was over or abated, he said, Rene, I cried a lot at the funeral. I cried a lot, for a couple of years afterwards. But he said, somehow, all of a sudden tonight, as I started talking about it, he said, I felt this immense hole at the very center of my body, in the chest. And he began talking. He said, my dad wasn't there when I went to my first prom to see me and my girlfriend all dressed up and ready to go. He wasn't there when I was quarterback on the football team or when I was made most valuable player in the conference in basketball. Small town, you play all sports. And then he said, I thought about graduation, and there happened to be an empty chair next to my mother and my sister. And he said, all of a sudden, I said, it's all gone. It's a hole that I will have for the rest of my life that I can never fill. And I want to use that image in particular for what I'm going to talk about now. And to know, however, that experience was not only terribly emotional for him, but it was really something that made me think a lot about death. I had certainly by that time experienced death of cousins, death of friends, and so on, but never anything like that. And that image of the hole in us after a death is what I want to talk about. And so what we find that one of the first feelings that we have very often is this: something is missing. That there's a hole that I can't fill. It's a part of my life that is not recoverable. And I want to move, after talking about that, to saying something on another image. And this image, the second image, is about the phantom limb phenomenon that I'm sure most of us know about, that a person who's been in an accident, loses an arm, loses a leg, will still feel that that leg is there. And as in the novel All Quiet on the Western Front, this guy, this soldier, says, I just wish somebody would scratch my leg. And the other soldiers who are standing around in the hospital with him are absolutely aware that that big wire thing covering over his leg says, there's no leg to scratch. And I think that's the second image that I find very powerful. That losing someone we love is like losing a limb or feeling that immense black hole right at the center of my being. And so the question happens, how do I deal with that? How do I deal with that hole, that missing limb? And first of all, I want to talk about old people who've died. And when you talk about old people, I want to talk about, not about myself, because I'm still around, but I want to talk about the way that an old person, when, let's say, her spouse or his spouse dies, and how you move on, how you go on from that. And I think I'm getting a little feedback. Is that okay? Does it bother anybody? Because I think I could either just come out here with my text, and then I don't think I'll get it. And so that I think what we experience first with any death is a kind of raw pain. A raw pain like the missing limb, a raw pain like that hole in the midst of our chest. And during the time of grief, initial grief, the funeral, visiting with one of you people, during that time, you know, all of the relatives are around. You're making arrangements. You've got to do this and do that and do this. But then, you know, a week afterwards, everybody's gone. And especially in our society today where people move away, all of a sudden, you're alone. And yes, family come back more often than they usually did to try to take care of mother or father who's just there. But you know, and this comes from a very, very recent experience, and partly also from the time when my mother died. But at the time of the recent experience, I was talking to my cousin's spouse. My cousin had just died at the age of 89, just a few days from his 90th birthday. And as she talked about it, she said, you know, I'm so lonely, but then the kids come and they're so gentle and so helpful. But she said, sometimes I just want them to go away. And the lesson that she got from that is that I love having the visits, but I want them to be short and direct and emotional. To be able to gather them around her, but then have them to leave so that she can go back to her mourning. And so I think the lesson for us out of all of that is to help, and it's different for every person, but as for my cousin's wife, she wanted visitors, she wanted the neighbors to come in, she wanted her sons and daughters to stop by and they were scattered all over the country, but she mostly needed to make those visits short. And so I think that one of the first things is that as wonderful as it is when you're in pain, to have somebody there that you can cry with, to have somebody there who shares grief with you, at the same time, there's a necessity for many people, not all, but for many people to have that time alone. Then there's something a few years ago that happened. And this was something that, even though I was in my late 70s or early 80s when this happened, that I hadn't learned yet. And so I would say to this particular woman, I'd say, "How's it going?" And one day she got so upset. She said, "How's it going? How the hell do you think it's going? My husband's dead. I have no kids. I'm alone in a house with a dog, and I love the dog, but that's not enough. That's not enough." And so I think what that brings up is sometimes the anger, the hurt and the anger. And so what it tells us, and this came up in your the witness speech that you just heard, what goes on there is a kind of necessity that we listen and we learn. Even after experiencing death of my parents, after experiencing my older sister dying at age 61, you still don't know. And you still learn again and again and again. And having presided at more funerals than I would like, though certainly not more funerals than most pastors have because I'm here teaching and so on, still that need just to listen and to give space for someone like this woman who was so angry at God, but angry also that I was so insensitive that I would ask this question, "How are you doing?" And so I think those are times when people need to be angry, need to have a time when the people that are with them don't react in anger. So I think another helpful step for many people who have lost a spouse and are searching a way to go on and slowly heal is if they have a couple of preschool grandchildren. Grandchildren, on the one hand, notice immediately that grandma or grandpa is sad. They don't know exactly why. They don't even know why grandpa isn't there anymore or why grandma didn't come with grandpa. But they perceive the sadness, and they will jump up on the lap and hug grandma or grandpa. And kids need love, and grandchildren are so helpful for that, especially little grandchildren who don't know yet the significance in their own life, but they see this grandpa or this grandma that they love very much, and they jump up in the lap and hug. And then grandparents will take care of the grandkids. And grandkids keep on having the same needs, those damn diapers that need to be changed, the crying, the tantrums, they're all there. There's something that they need to take care of. And one of the things that I've found as in other people's describing their mourning is they'll say something like, oh, it really helped me to get involved with foster grandparents or with a program like that. It helped me to get involved with tutoring kids in reading at the local school. All of those things touch the need to love. And, as with the grandkids, the need to be loved, to love and be loved. And grandkids, though they can be sometimes a little annoying, can also be a wonderful healing, but they are a demand on the grandparent. And that grandparent realizes that here is life that needs to go on. And so there's all kinds of church groups, all kinds of civic groups that work with trying to help people in that stage, not just the initial stage, but the first 3, 4, 5 years. Now, I think older people certainly are not waiting for death, but are more accustomed. It's not a surprise than it is when you're younger or middle-aged. But nevertheless, the pain of being with somebody, as this woman who got angry with me, she said, I am so lonely, just so lonely. That hole in her life with the man that she had been with for all of her married life, and feeling just there's nobody to walk with. I remember a photo that I used in a wedding that I presided at many, many years ago, in which this old man and this old woman, and this was a normal age couple in their 20s getting married, but this old man and this old woman were moving down a pathway, and you saw, here is this woman leaning on the man, and by some miracle, the man was also leaning on the woman, so that you felt that if either one of them moved, both of them would fall to the ground. And I think that's a picture, really, of what all of this means for death. It certainly means finding something more to love and to be loved. I think parenthetically, I'd like to say just something about a novel that I love. It was published in 1957, but it's called Death in the Family, which gives you a kind of experience of how little kids, one was in first grade, the other one was preschool. A Death in the Family by James Agee. And in that novel, you get, I think, a really wonderful picture of what it feels like for little kids to experience death. And that novel I certainly would recommend. Another huge temptation for people who have lost one of their parents, now I'm talking about the next generation down, not the death in that, but one of the temptations is to do everything for them. And you know, whether it's good or bad, in our country, we get a lot of our self-worth from work. And so, oh, Grandpa, I'll do that. Grandma, don't you worry about anything. We'll take care of it. We'll shovel the snow. We'll get everything out. Well, shoveling snow is probably a good thing for kids to say to their grieving parent. But I think there's so much in our life that loving children can mistake about old age. And old age, whether it's people who are grieving the loss of a spouse, or a great friend or whatever, one of the things is they need to feel worthwhile. And that people who are dealing with gerontology tell us all the time. You know, let your parents do what they can do. Let them fix meals if that's what they want to do. Let them be involved. And don't just make them sit there. And very often, sons and daughters will feel, I owe everything to my mother and my father. I need to do absolutely everything for them that I can. Even have them move in, which I think usually is a bad idea, but that's not always, but usually is a bad idea. But what very often when the son or daughter invites parents to move in, and the parent responds yes and feels joyful, but they never let her do a thing again. She sits there, both of them are like the classic elf on the shelf. They're there, people don't listen to them really, but they carry on with just being there, sitting there. And one of the things, and you don't have to have a grieving self to experience this, as I sometimes do, when you're old, you know, you say something and there's a polite pause while people let you say what you have to say. And then it's as though during that whole time they've been deaf. And so the conversation goes like this, and then there's this break, this mysterious break while you're talking, and then things go on as though you had never ever said a thing. And that comes back to that necessity to listen and to respond. But to listen, as St. Benedict says, with the ear of the heart, saying to yourself, what is she saying? What is hurting her? What are we doing that we might do differently? And universally, one of the things is to listen and to take account of what the person is saying. I want to just look at what I've skipped so far. Another thing, now going to middle-aged people who have lost someone. And when I'm talking about middle-aged people, it's people who are involved in a job, carrying on in that work. And though work can be a way of not feeling what you need to feel, work can also be a wonderful way to recoup. When my sister died at age 61, and at the time I was 59, I had to come back and teach the next day after the funeral. And I had to continue to teach. And that was the same way for my mother's death on a very, very cold January morning. And then I had to come back, and classes started the next day. And so you begin. My dad was kind enough to die in the summer. But in any case, what I found is that work and continuation of work and continuation of that routine and rhythm of what you're doing is extremely, extremely helpful. And so, now I need to look at my watch so I don't go too late. I quit by 5:02, is that right? Okay. Can you be a timekeeper for me, Josie? Thank you. So what I want to talk about is that the way that other things can be really helpful. And one of them you saw at the end of the previous thing, and that's music. I think music has a way of bringing forth our emotions, and it may be classical music, it may be jazz, it may be almost anything, any kind of music. But listening to music can be such a wonderful solace. And I think also the other part of the arts, novels, short stories. I think there's so many, but Joan Didion's memoir, really, of the death of her husband, and then a few months later, the death of her daughter, Quintana. I love that book. It's all about her grieving process. It's, now I have to look and see what it's called, A Year of Magical Thinking. And that one touches every nerve in my body as I was going through the grieving process for my own parents and for my sister, and then later for another sister and several brothers-in-law. And, you know, all of that has been a wonderful help. A very easy death, the War and Peace of Tolstoy, and the death of Prince Andrew is so right, I think. So right in what's going on. And Simone de Beauvoir's A Very Easy Death, about the death of her mother. And then the poems of Emily Dickinson, especially the Death series. Because I could not stop for death, death kindly stopped for me. It's such a beautiful poem. And it awakens emotion in me so that, like Tim, periodically I can let that out. I can scratch that phantom limb. And so with, there's other things. One is, I give a little bit of caution to you, but it's a movie called The Island, but it's a French-Japanese movie, but there's no subtitles. Thank you. There's no subtitles in it, but it's an absolutely marvelous film about two little boys and the parents, and one of the little boys dies. And the response of the way that the parents handle that is so beautiful. And every time I see that movie, I weep, and I've seen it many times. So the reason I said you have to be careful with this is because the title in French is The Naked Island. So I had asked Burdette, who used to be in charge of videos and all of that here, I asked her if she could order that for my class, and she called me up and she said, "Are you sure you want that movie?" And I said, "Yeah." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Well, they've got a whole bunch of naked people on the cover of the slip cover that we used to have." But so order it as The Island, or tell them what it's about, and then they'll get it if you ever want to watch it. And the death of Markle in Dostoevsky is a really ravishing, beautiful story of a teenager moving out of a kind of junior high atheism into his belief in God. But it's a beautiful, beautiful story. I want to how much time have I got? 5 minutes. So I want to tell the story, even though it's a little longer, and that means that I may not talk about as much about other things. But Riley Charbonneau was a student on my floor, probably in the late 90s, I would guess. And then he was also an Army nurse, and he went to Iraq in the Iraq War, the Second Iraq War, as a nurse, and he was at Abu Ghraib, and Abu Ghraib, as many of you know probably, was a prison, but in the middle of it was a hospital. And at one point, he was asked, you know, what's really different now that you've made a book with another former student named Monica, and they had done this book together, and so they had seen each other a lot as going over pictures that Riley had taken and getting them fixed in the book. And Professor Livingston at a book promotion here at St. Ben's was asked the question, you know, Riley, what does it feel like now after you've had this experience and seeing it, seeing this book and going over those photos again and again? And he said, well, it makes me able to look at the photos now without too much emotion. It still makes me feel sad, but there's not a lot of emotion that's there as there was at the beginning when I couldn't look at them. And so Michael had asked about one particular photo of a truck moving up with soldiers on it, moving up towards the prison and towards the hospital. And as he did that, all of a sudden, he began to weep again. And he wept for probably 30 seconds, and he says, I couldn't believe that I still felt that. There was this truck that was coming in, looked absolutely normal to me, but it was a truck that had been somehow wired, and as the soldiers in the truck got close to the hospital, it blew up. And there was blood everywhere. And then he, without showing any of the faces, of course, he showed pictures. The book was approved by the Army. It showed blood, it showed bloody bodies, you know, covering their head. But again, you feel that returning grief. And it's important, I think, to raise that up. Now, just a couple words about death of young people, which is so sad. And death always seems to come before the work of life is finished. But finding some completion is not easy, and I'm sure you've experienced this. One of the worst things to say is, oh, she's in a better place now. Or, you know, here's your little angel. And, you know, to be in a better place where I'm not, where my husband and I are not, and there's anger that comes forth from that kind of statement. And here I recommend to you a really wonderful little story, short story by Raymond Carver called A Small Good Thing. And then again, I would say The Island, because it's a little boy that dies in that movie. I want to skip now just to the end. And I think for many people, healing is helped by faith. Not everybody has faith, but for me personally, it's been a very great help. Not that that pain is completely taken away, because still we have doubts. What if there isn't something afterwards? But at the same time, that sense of there is something more. there is a time, as Augustine says, he learned to accept the death of his young friend, partly by making more friends, partly by conversation, partly by realizing above all that he would see that friend again in the next life. The story is not finished. The story may not be finished, but I'm finished. And so, thank you. Thank you.